In January 1866, a Treasury clerk in Washington tallied the books. The Civil War income tax had expired. The federal government posted its first surplus without it. They would run 28 surpluses in a row. Not estimated, not modeled, but directly recorded in official ledgers. Those numbers contained revenue from a world before the permanent income tax. That single unbroken streak makes one of the most popular theories on the internet physically impossible. And the true story it tells is more disturbing than the theory it replaces. You have probably seen the video, or maybe more than one. The thesis goes something like this, and it spreads fast. The modern federal government is simply too large and too complex to survive without a permanent income tax. Without it, essential services would disappear overnight. The national debt would spiral out of control. The wealthy would pay nothing, and the entire system would collapse. It is presented as simple arithmetic, an unavoidable necessity of 20th and 21st century governance. And now, through decades of political acceptance, the truth is being kept from you. It is a compelling shape. I understand why it spreads. But I have spent weeks inside the source material, and what I found is not what the theory promised. The real fiscal history of post-Civil War America is stranger, darker, and more deliberately hidden than any big government necessity narrative. It just involves different villains. Let me start with the tax itself, because that is where every version of this theory starts. The Civil War income tax, enacted in 1861 to help finance the Union effort against the Confederacy. It was the first federal tax on personal income in American history. Rates began at 3% on incomes over $800 and rose to 5% on higher brackets. Congress repeatedly described the measure as temporary, a wartime emergency tool. And in 1872, 7 years after the war ended, they kept their word. They repealed the income tax entirely. The federal government did not collapse. It kept operating. Not for 1 year or two. For the next 28 consecutive years, America ran its books without any federal income tax whatsoever. Here is what the claim leaves out. Beginning in 1866, the United States Treasury recorded surplus after surplus, not estimated, not projected in optimistic budgets, but actual revenue collected exceeding actual spending, documented year after year in official ledgers. Those surpluses were substantial. They allowed the government to systematically reduce the enormous Civil War debt while funding every federal department through tariffs on imports and excise taxes on domestic goods. I want to be honest about something. I nearly moved on from this topic after the initial Treasury numbers. The debunking felt almost too clean, too tidy. 3 days into the primary, reports from the Bureau of the Treasury, I had a draft that was sharp, airtight, and completely lifeless. It read like a correction, not a story. And corrections do not change minds because they do not answer the question underneath the question. The question underneath is not really about tax brackets or revenue shortfalls. It is about why the official history of American taxation feels so thin. Why a period of such proven success went largely unmentioned for so long. That question deserves a real answer, not a dismissal. So I kept digging. Starting around 1866, the United States operated under a tariff-driven revenue system that most Americans today would find unrecognizable. Imported goods faced duties that flowed directly into federal coffers. Additional revenue came from excises on whiskey, tobacco, refined sugar, and certain manufactured items. This was not an experimental policy. Tariffs had been the primary source of federal revenue since the earliest days of the Republic. But in the booming industrial decades after the Civil War, this system generated far more money than the relatively small federal government required. The result was a predictable and consistent pattern of budget surpluses. In 1866, the surplus exceeded $30 million. By the 1870s, annual surpluses routinely climbed above $100 million. These were enormous sums, when the entire federal budget often ranged between $300 and $400 million total. Still, the government took in more than it spent. The pattern repeated relentlessly. New Congresses would make minor adjustments to tariff schedules. Revenue from a rapidly expanding import base would surge. Spending on Civil War pensions, harbor improvements, and the military never quite kept pace. The Treasury would close each fiscal year firmly in the black. This happened every single year for 28 straight years. The national debt, which had ballooned to over $2.5 billion by the end of the Civil War, began a steady and impressive decline. Hundreds of millions were paid down during this period, all of it accomplished without touching the incomes of American citizens through a federal income tax. This is the context that every modern video claiming income tax is indispensable completely ignores. In those decades, the United States was already transforming into a major industrial power. Its federal government was expanding its responsibilities. Yet year after year, it proved that tariffs and excises alone could fund Washington while simultaneously reducing debt. Then came the Panic of 1893. Banks failed. Unemployment soared. The tariff system that had produced consistent surpluses suddenly generated shortfalls. President Grover Cleveland, a Democrat committed to lower tariffs, watched revenue collapse. The Depression exposed the vulnerability of relying so heavily on import duties during economic contraction. Congress responded with the Wilson-Gorman Tariff Act of 1894. Tacked onto that bill was a new 2% income tax on incomes above $4,000. It was modest. It was framed as a temporary measure to balance the books. The Supreme Court struck it down in 1895, ruling it unconstitutional. But the political momentum did not stop. The push for a permanent income tax gained steam in the Progressive era. Reformers argued that tariffs burdened the working class while shielding the rich. They pointed to growing inequality. They cited the need for a more stable revenue source during panics. What the official histories usually leave out is how much this was also about shifting power. Industrialists and bankers who once benefited from high tariffs began to see advantages in a direct tax they could influence or minimize through loopholes. Labor unions and populists saw it as a tool against concentrated wealth. The debate was never purely about necessity. It was about who would pay and who would control the purse. By 1909, the political pressure became irresistible. Congress passed the 16th Amendment. It granted the federal government explicit power to levy income taxes without apportionment among the states. Ratification took 4 years. In February 1913, the amendment became part of the Constitution. The Revenue Act of that same year imposed the first permanent federal income tax. Rates started at 1% on incomes over $3,000 and rose to 7% on the highest brackets. The modern era of withholding and expanded federal spending had begun. The documented record tells a different story than the necessity myth. It was not an unavoidable arithmetic truth. It was a political ceasefire between competing interests during economic turmoil, which brings me back to the surpluses. The thing that started this, and the thing that ends the theory. In those 28 years, the federal government proved it could operate, reduce the Civil War debt by more than $1 billion, and meet every obligation without any federal income tax. Not estimated, not modeled, but directly recorded in Treasury ledgers year after year. Those black ink entries contained revenue from a world before the permanent income tax. That single unbroken streak makes one of the most popular theories on the internet physically impossible. The necessity myth gets one thing right, even if it gets the specifics wrong. The history of American taxation is a history of concealment. Politicians hid the success of the tariff era to justify expanded powers. Textbooks scrubbed the surplus decades because they complicated the story of inevitable progress. The commercial and political battles that drove the income tax have been almost entirely erased from popular memory. 28 years of surpluses and debt reduction. That is an erased chapter. It is just not the one with a catchy name. And there are real unknowns. The deep politics behind the 16th Amendment ratification, the exact influence of banking and industrial lobbies, remain subjects of serious historical debate. The long-term effects of shifting from tariffs to income taxes on growth and innovation are still being traced. Subtle questions about revenue elasticity in a global economy are only beginning to be mapped. We have not found every answer yet. These are open doors, honest ones. They do not require you to believe the impossible. They require you to accept that there are fiscal realities beneath the surface we have not yet fully read. The difference between a conspiracy and a mystery is whether the answer is already decided before you ask the question. A conspiracy needs you to know what is hidden. A mystery invites you to look. The Treasury ledgers hold 28 years of proven success, compressed into line after line of black ink thinner than a policy footnote, and we have only just learned how to read what they really mean for today. That story, the real one, has barely begun, and unlike the one being sold to you, it does not need a narrative of big government inevitability to be extraordinary. It already is.